Meaning that if you're not the progeny, as an example, if you're not the progeny of the Moors, etc., you cannot use Moorish treaties to entertain your liberties, etc. If you're not a citizen or national of Russia, you can't use the Russian constitution as a defense. If you're not a national or citizen of China, you cannot use the Chinese constitutions or principal laws of liberty to secure your rights. That's common sense. One of the traps that we have been suffering from has been the false concepts that have been promoted under the artificial 14th Amendment operations of civil rights fiction that has been promoted at North America since the 1800s under the guise of liberating Moors of African descent who they had branded as Negroes and blacks under the pretext that they were going to get some rights. Have you noticed even to this day, none of those rights have been recognized? Everybody talks about them, but they still do what? Ritual murders on the street by the day. They have their communities are gentrified. The land of the people have been stolen over and over again in multiple municipal jurisdictions with no protections whatsoever. Women have been raped, murdered in jail, out of jail, on the streets, in their homes, etc. And then you have paid operatives marching these people around talking about U.S. citizens, and they haven't caught on yet that they've been played. They're not a party to the Constitution. They're not a party to the treaties. However, their forebears are, i.e., but their forebears are Moors, but they claim to be black. Therefore, black people have no rights because there's no such people. They never wrote a treaty or a constitution nowhere on the planet Earth. And there's no such place on the earth called Blackadonia, Negro Diner, or Colophia. Doesn't exist. Get over it and get real.
So, Carl, QL says, do Moors need the MSTOA to control governmental operation here in North America?
MSTOA is an organization or outreach organization to bring people back into the constitutional fold of government. That's its missionary work. However, within that structure, Noble Drew Ali did set up a governmental structure. The fact that it has not been operative is quite evident. And so do a little bit of research and answer that yourself. With an addition, I'll make this statement. Noble Drew Ali wrote a direct letter to be read before the temples inferring infiltration into the movement where people were trying to take over the movement and trying to dismiss him out of the movement. So he was already talking about infiltration by people who thought his position was just a joke, and then finding out from the nations of the earth, but they don't recognize the movement without him as the head. So when you talk about the great sellout, and then you're talking about enforcing international constitutional law, because keep in mind, I know that some of you familiar where you hear this statement: come all ye Asiatics of North America and hear the truth about your nationality and your birthright. You are not Negro, black, colored, or Ethiopian. Come and link yourselves. Learn of your ancient mothers and fathers, ancient and divine creed. Come and link yourselves back with the families of nations. So clearly that's a civic statement indicating international venue, and an international venue relative to diversity of nationality, where any issues or controversies of land grants, etc., or international rights and liberties are concerned, is an international consular venue. That's a fact, i.e. in Article 3 platform on an international venue as described in Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution for the United States, coming off the treaties that superseded. That's a fact.
Just trying to see if there's any other questions that you need to address. Okay, James Todd says, how do you identify yourself between our Native American blood and Moorish blood, and which treaties do we use?
Well, it's very easily. The tag Native American was created in the 1930s by the occupational Europeans. There is no such thing as Native Americans, i.e. they're all Moors. Whether you talk about the Nanakoke, the Wachita, etc., the Nanakoke, the Mohican, etc., Seminole, Onondaga, etc., all of the different tribes, they are Canaanite, Moabite descent, and some from Sinde that you call India, are Naga and Bantu. That's the fact. And collectively, you can call them all Phoenicians. There you go.
I don't know what this question means. This is what about California?
From Khalifa, that's where you get Caliph from. From Khalifa. Queen Khalifa. You'll see, if you go in Khalifa land, you'll see they'll have all over California this Berber queen with dreads. And people be looking at it, but they're not told the history. Well, yeah, that's Khalifa's land, yes. Oh, you're home. Get over it, Dorothy.
Another question is, would you be able to utilize the Bill of Rights?
See, this is the point. The principles that are embodied in the Bill of Rights pre-exist the Bill of Rights as written in that Constitution. Keep in mind that these principles of that Constitution are already Muslim law that already exist. They're adopted by the hybrid Europeans to do business at Morocco. So the Constitution is adopted from Muslim law. So, but those principles already exist. It's not given by that Constitution. They already exist with you. You don't need to use that. You need to use your divine birthright and all treaties superseding that Constitution. The Constitution is just simply the obligation of them doing business on our land, which turns them back and reminds them of their obligations to the treaties, i.e., all debts and contracts, Article 6, Supremacy Clause. All debts and contracts entered into before the adoption of this Constitution are binding against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. And all treaties made or which shall be made under their authority, under the authority of the United States, shall be the quote-unquote supreme law of the land. And the judges of every state shall be bound thereby. And any laws or constitution to the contrary, of any states to the contrary, notwithstanding. So when you look at that Constitution, you're always thinking treaty, superseding it. So the Constitution pushes them back to their obligations to you in the first place. Why do you think that most of the politicians don't honor the Constitution? Why do you think the magistrates, the administrative executives claiming to be judges get upset as soon as someone talks about the Constitution? Because they are anti-Constitution, i.e. anti-treaty.
Someone just clarified and said that they were talking about reparations in California.
I know they talk about it in a lot of places. Now, let's deal with this. Reparations, and you know this is very important. Reparations specifically is the venue operations in international law, whereas one or more specific nation states specifically identified are charged on an international venue, i.e. international court of law, as an an aggressor or party that created an injury on another specified and identified nation state, etc., with all claims specifically listed and given support or factual supports, etc. So specifically an identified specific nation or nations being by law commanded to repair and to restore injuries done to another specifically named and identified people / nation, etc., as remedy. That's called reparations. And I suggest you all go into your law books and look at it. And so when you start coming talking about people of color and the green nation, and it doesn't matter what color you are, nation was injured by some other, doesn't matter what color you are, nation, that stuff is not going to work. The other thing I would suggest that many of you do, look into some of the incidents that took place at the United Nations. And one of the interesting things was, and you all look this up, when Ralph Bunche went before the United States talking about Negroes and rights, etc., and then a lot of the representatives of nations, quote unquote, I repeat, nations got up and walked out because he was insulting them, as if he, being a Mason, just like most of them, didn't know that these people ain't Negroes and blacks, that they're Moors. But you can't bring up some fictional brand name as a nation and entertain international law. Stop lying. Get over it. Our people keep trying to be somebody that they're not, and then trying to get the protections of international law on a platform of which they are not a party. You can't use a brand and argue legitimate law. It doesn't happen. Or in the principle of law, they say a slave can't own property, and therefore a slave not owning property can't claim the liberties or the rights or the inheritances that go with said property, less more even owning self.
I went to, I recently looked at a video that showed proof that there were Moors, were melanated men that owned slaves.
Yes.
So slave had nothing to do.
Exactly, it's a status.
And the slaves were of both, of multiple nationalities.
Let's put it, so slave is connotative.
Slavic.
Now, slave is actually Slovakian.
Right.
And it is a term that's contemporary in nature. It's not an ancient term. It is a contemporary, in its connotative form, it's a contemporary connotative form that is used and adopted from the operations of the subjugation of Slovakian people, hybrid Europeans in Northern Asia under Russian operations. And so the shortened term Slav or slave has been used for subjugation. Now, that's a nationality, or that's a general pedigree of some Europeans. Now, connotatively, the subjugation action was connotatively adopted in terms of oppressed people, and thus slave is used connotatively, not properly, but connotatively in what you would call suppressive operations, and in particular suppressive operations under colonial operations connotatively of suppressing people of African descent. So African people of African descent, i.e. Canaanites, Moabites, known as Moors, have been designated connotatively, operationally, under the term slave, but they in fact were not slave, they were bound free men. Slave is actually the hybrid European Slovakian nations, Czechoslovakia, etc. And that's fact. So we must also be clear that when certain terms are used, we must be clear between connotative presentment, distinguished from, in fact, the true etymological meanings and histories of certain words. And so you'll see a lot of times people or writers or scholars will take the connotative use of the word slave and place it in a time period in more earlier times, when in fact that is a false position, because it was not used connotatively in earlier forms prior to the Russian occupation of the Slovakian nation areas. That's a fact. It's sort of like people get used to scholars or people claiming to be scholars throwing the word slave around and then putting it back into a period of history when it did not exist in its connotative form. That's sort of like people wanting to have a discussion today about whether George Washington, the ninth president for the United States, whether he used an iPhone or iPhone 10 or iPhone 11 or Samsung. It's like having that kind of argument. It's irrelevant. Most likely he didn't have a cell phone at all. Not that that technology didn't exist even prior to him. We're just saying in relationship to their real operations. He probably didn't have an iPhone. And that's the same thing talking about slavery in ancient times.
I want to read a comment from Malik Imhotep Bata El Bey. So the prophet prophesied that I'm going to leave the European here just long enough to teach you how to run a government. I bought you everything it takes to save a nation. Now take it and save yourself.
Exactly.
Each soul is accountable for its actions. Understanding yourself as master and servant of your own government will remove from thee the cares and solicitudes in life, national divine movement in the mind, which goes in line with the quote or that I shared with you.
Yes.
That knowing yourself and
is
where
important.
you really are the two most important issues that you should be involved with. It is your task to find out.
Exactly.
In fact, if someone, and this is what kind of drove this particular topic, because so many people want someone to give them A, B, C, D,
and they must
1,
become
2,
a
3.
part to it.
But it said it is your task to find out. In fact, if someone gave you the correct answers, it would not mean a thing to you, for they would not be attached to you in a way that
exactly
if you would have found them yourself.
And this is where Drew Ali had said, if I told you everything, he said, the half has not been told. If I told you everything, you would go back to sleep. Study yourselves.
Right.
You know, and keep in mind, a lot of times, and this has been our experience over the years, and very often we have this discussion where people come to a forum like this and they expect you to give them a red pill or a blue pill outside of knowledge, if you get the point, or to rescue them, or we got a headache, give us an aspirin. They're stealing our rights, give us a pill. Make a statement so I can go into a court, not even identifying that these places aren't courts, you know, and then having what you call these pill expectations, which is a wrong concept. And then you find people will become cognizant of some of these facts and want to cure overnight, but they have not been participating or active in their responsibility to themselves and their families in relationship to their status and in relationship to absorbing this information and expanding on it. But they want the benefit of it. The same way when you see a lot of people get cognizant of this information now, because we're already under attack. It doesn't just arrive. We're already under attack. And I know that you've experienced over this last decade and more, people coming into this forum, even at the House of Reawakening Minds, as I have, you know, experienced people coming into the roundtable venue for years. When the doo-doo hits the fan and the corporate operatives are openly abusing them, you know, it's not subtle. Then they come to start a process of learning and want to know this overnight when they really haven't been participating. And you can give them certain answers, and it's not absorbed in them because it's not a party. They're not a party to it. So it is not a party to them. Not that it doesn't belong to them. And then there's the lack of knowing and lack of understanding and the false expectations, whereas they are not aware that these so-called administrative executives who have been claiming to be judges are Masons, Knights Templars, Skull and Bones, Knights of Columbus, and know already that these people are Moors. And when these people come before them making arguments, they can easily tell whether these people have been studying or not. You know, like when, you know, it's sort of like they keep assuming that the hybrid Europeans don't know who they are. Many people keep assuming that the hybrid European forgot that he's a colonist. And that because he claims to be an American, that he's convinced that he's American and you're supposed to be convinced that he's American, and he operates from that perspective. And then when you hold him or her to their obligations to the treaties and the Constitution, all of a sudden they get scramble minded and start acting like they don't know what you're talking about, or you don't know what you're talking about. But the real deal is they know that if you knew constitutional principles, you wouldn't be in that venue, and that you would, if you were forced into that venue, that you would challenge the jurisdiction with an averment of jurisdiction, or quo warranto, and command his obligation to the treaty, and it would automatically revert to a consular court via what Dwight D. Eisenhower suspended in 1954 when they introduced their 32 and 33 degree Mason civil rights marching guys and girls to deceive the people into the 14th Amendment fraud, instead of telling them the proper venue was consular court that he suspended. Oh, nobody wants to go there, do they?
Which probably leads into Bantu Mandika's question of, so why haven't the Moors brought the government up on charges? The de facto government, I would say.
They have been on many fronts, but mostly we've been pretty much blocked from international venues, and we've been most of the time challenging their jurisdiction into in the private for-profit human trafficking municipal venues, most of which we have been forced into, etc. However, most of the people, when they're making that statement, must also recognize that they themselves, while asking that question, are responsible to this along with us, and should have been with us and other active Moors in that support, because that's a necessary fact, which is also why over the years we've been struggling to get our people cognate of their true identity and status, and their obligation to be involved into the divine and more national movement on the planet. I think too often they're looking for other people to be sacrificial lamb. This is part of the training, and do the work, and then they step on board and get the benefit after the fact, rather than jumping on board, because it's their responsibility too. I think this also comes from the misconception where people are looking at the Moorish movement as an idea of, or some club, or some people that are conscious, as opposed to being their responsibility. It's in their inheritance, their pedigree, their bloodline too. And I think this is also problematic, where many conscious Moors have been teaching or presenting the nationality as a religion, distinguished from the fact that that's a pedigree, and they also have an obligation to inheritances and to treaties that have not been exercised, which is what they see taking place. And that is their duty and responsibility to get on board and help. Don't look at the wagon, people struggling to push the wagon, get behind and push this wagon too, because it's yours too. It's your birthright. And a lot of people don't see it as their responsibility.
But when you think in terms of the fact that we're under occupation and have been for so long, it's as if in this time someone totally unknown to you or unrelated to you would just walk into where you domicile and take up residence and start to order you around and legislate how things are.
This is what they've been doing.
And take your stuff.
That's exactly what they've been doing. Now, exactly what you're saying. Now look at this. This is one to show the people, to demonstrate just what you're saying. This is why we talk to people to get an idea of what your position should be in the political forum. We remind people to read the Organic Act of Congress, 1871, February 2nd. We also recommend them to do the research on the Woodrow Wilson administration, excerpt 1913. Then we also represent to them to read House Joint Resolution 192, 73rd Congress in session June the 5th of 1933. And it becomes very obvious what the politics are really, that's really operating on the land is. And also to study intently the word and the application of hypothecation. And also in recognizing the operation of the skull and bone operators of the Circle Church and the Chancery via Franklin Delano Roosevelt with pledging the birth certificates as bonds to refund the again bankrupted U.S. corporation operations, United States, etc. And this would pretty much become obvious to everyone, the politics. And what I recognize that while we've been sharing this information with people for 40 years or more, that people keep looking at it as our information or like our ideas rather than this is established fact. And this is where your economic and political problems have their origin. Yours as well as ours. It's not ours that we're informing you of. It is all of our problems, economic and political, that we've been suffering from, and then calling it other things falsely, like racism and prejudice, when you're actually under occupation. You're suffering under the doctrine of discovery and unum sanctum operations. That's the fact. Take responsibility and help get this work done. Because remember, their position is, if you don't declare a right, from their position, although it's immoral and unethical, they hold truthfully, openly, and by policy. Any rights not claimed by the people are abandoned, and they claim them as fiduciaries. And so not only do they use birth certificates to fund by bonds the United States Corporation Company, but also all marriage certificates and all licenses and CDLs, etc., are bonded and sold as derivatives on the world market. This is part of what has frozen up now. And the nations of the earth are no longer buying them. They tried, as a matter of fact, they tried, I think a couple of years ago, just before Trump came in, to refund the United States again, I think around 2013, when the Pope Francis did, as many of you who have been keeping up with what we've been sharing with you over the years, the motu proprio issued by Pope Francis in 2013 when the United States went bankrupt again, and they told them they weren't going to buy any more of their bonds that were leaned against the people's birth certificates. This is another reason why no one wants to talk about the crash that took place in late 2007 and 2008 is subsistent to what is going on right now. They never fixed it. That's the fact. And it's just that the credit windows and the trade windows of the world have frozen up. And the other fact, Donald J. Trump is using the Zionist order of the Federal Reserve according to their operations, and it was absorbed into the IMF, i.e. the U.S. Treasury, which is actually the International Monetary Fund, and he's issuing the debt against the banks. It's why they don't like him, because he's using their very stuff against them.
Is he also trying to preserve some pensions?
Oh, because it would see, this is what would happen. And again, I don't want you all to get this twisted. I'm not defending Donald Trump. If Donald Trump hadn't been using the Jesuit or Zionist order operation of the banks, their own system against themselves, many of you who had pensions would not be receiving any pension checks right now today. Now that's the truth, even though it's still colored. And if you notice that the stock market is going up, but jobs is going down, it also clearly shows you there's no correlation whatsoever. But when they talk to the people as if the stock market is a representation of the gross national product and of the economic operations on the land. The operations of the stock market constantly going up, drops a little bit and then goes back up, drops a little bit and goes back up. Then gold and silver goes down, etc. And the people don't notice that there's no correlation, that the entire situation, the operations of their economic system is totally, absolutely manipulated. And that the stock market and the employment, etc., has no relationship whatsoever. Also notice that all of your major corporations, i.e. sort of like the Gates Foundation and other foundations, have exponentially generated billions of dollars in these last few months when the so-called COVID thing comes in, and all of the people and their accounts have gone the opposite direction, and the people don't recognize that there's a correlation in the fact that there's no correlation between the stock market and the economics of the people. A lot of things would you would answer yourself if you pay attention to things. Don't pay attention to what the politicians say. Pay attention to what's happening to you. And I'm also not saying that that's totally terrible, because in another way, it's sort of like they're still fighting over your estate. That's what you really need to know.